Well, hello, folks. Welcome to the Dusty Trails and Tall Tales podcast. I'm Matthew, your host. Tonight we have a very special guest joining us, author Elisabeth Grace Foley. She's an accomplished writer of historical fiction and Western mysteries, with works ranging from her Mrs. Meade mysteries to A Sidekick's Tale, and her latest collection, The Smoking Iron and Other Stories. She's also a two-time Peacemaker Award finalist. We're going to dive into her writing process, her inspirations, and what it takes to craft compelling Western fiction in today's literary landscape. Plus, we'll be discussing some of her most beloved books and thoughts on the state of the genre. Elisabeth, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Why don't you tell us what first inspired you to write Western fiction and historical mysteries?
Well, I think they both go back a long way to when I was a little girl. I've loved westerns my whole life. Um, when I grew up, my father used to watch John Wayne movies and all the old classic westerns, and I always enjoyed stories, both for school and pleasure. I enjoyed reading stories set throughout American history and frontier stories in particular, from Little House on the Prairie and others. So I was also your stereotypical horse crazy little girl, and so I loved the fact that westerns were full of horses. So I loved the setting and westerns in general ever since I was a kid. And then when I was a teenager, I discovered Western fiction. I think I started with Zane Grey and moved on from there. And it was a kind of a discovery. Wow, there's not just movies and TV shows, there's books too. And I'd always wanted to be a writer. I was always writing and inventing stories since I was a kid. And so it was kind of natural to move into writing Westerns too once I'd started reading them.
Was there a particular book that sparked your interest?
Well, as an adult, the first Zane Grey that I read was The Light of Western Stars. Going back into childhood, I can't even remember what was the earliest book with a Western or frontier setting. Probably the Little House on the Prairie books. But yeah, that was the first I read by Zane Grey. And I read through a whole bunch of his as a teenager, and then I moved on to Louis L'Amour and Max Brand, and then in later years found some of my favorite authors, B.M. Bauer and Eugene Manlove Rhodes, Dorothy Johnson. They're probably my top three now.
Yeah, for me it was Louis L'Amour.
Yeah, my favorite L'Amour is Last Stand at Papago Wells. Have you read that one?
I've read all of them like 3 or 4
Have you?
times. Flint's probably my favorite. So how long have you known you wanted to be a writer?
Um, well, like I said, I that was another thing I always enjoyed through childhood, inventing stories, telling myself stories, and then writing them down too. Probably about the time I was preteen, 10, 12, I used to think, when I grow up, I want to write books.
Hmm.
And then I drifted away from it a little bit in my early teens. And then about age 16, 17, I got serious about writing again and started actually thinking about getting published.
How do you approach writing a new story? Do you outline it extensively or just come up with it as you go?
Well, usually when I have an idea, I just kind of mull it over in my head for a while and, well, see if it works. And then when I start to realize, yeah, this is working and I think I want to write this, then I usually start by jotting down a list of character names, just kind of the basic plot points. And then I don't outline in detail, but I have to have kind of an idea of where I'm going. If it's a short story, I usually end up with like a list of scenes, and for a novel, I have to know my ending before I begin, or else I get stuck somewhere in the middle. But I
Yeah.
guess I kind of do a loose outline.
Have you ever started with a plan and had the story go a completely different direction?
Mm, yeah, probably not dramatically different, but I have had new ideas come to me in in the process, in the middle of writing the story, and worked them in.
How much research do you do to ensure historical accuracy?
Um, well, usually I'm writing in a setting or a time period that already interests me, so I've usually read something about it to begin with. And if it's on a specific niche subject or year or place, then I'll sometimes read a handful of books before I start. I don't often do like research reading while I'm in the process of writing the book because I don't want it to influence me too much. I feel like, especially if I read other novels for inspiration. But once I have my rough draft written and I'm in the editing stage, then I'll go through and, just kind of make a list of things that I have to check to get this right. And then I'll go back and look up specific facts, small things, fine tune like that. So, yeah, a little bit of general research beforehand and then more detailed stuff afterwards during editing.
Uh, I have a question from a viewer. How many total books have you published?
If you don't count individual short stories published as ebooks, I believe it's about 15, 15 or 16, although some of those are a little shorter, novelette, novella length. The Mrs. Meade mysteries, for instance, are short, all under 30,000 words, and some of them under 20.
Do you self-publish your books?
Yes, I do. Yep.
Do you enjoy that more than having a traditional publisher?
Well, I like the creative freedom of it and also being able to work on my own schedule. Um, Marketing is a challenge, but I've heard that that's a challenge even for traditionally published authors these days. But yes, I'm comfortable with self-publishing. I'm glad that's the route that I took.
Yeah. Well, who does your covers? Because most of your covers are very well done.
I've worked with a couple of different cover designers. The Mrs. Meade mystery and my historical fairy tales are by, oh dear, I forget her name, but her company name was Historical Editorial. And Land of Hills and Valleys and a Sidekick's Tale, also Bridge, no, definitely Land of Hills and Valleys and a Sidekick's Tale were also by another designer, Jennifer Zemanek. And my early westerns were by a designer who's no longer in business, and my most recent two westerns, The Smoking Iron and Outlaw Fever, those two I actually did myself.
Oh, wow.
I'm not a graphic artist. I'm not a cover designer, but I did manage to squeak out a couple that I was pleased with. For anything more complex, I would definitely hire a real artist, though.
Yeah. That's another question. How many pages a day do you write?
Oh, I I am a slow writer and I write by hand. So I go by handwritten pages rather than typed pages. Lately, it's only been, when I'm working on a story right now that's giving me trouble, and I consider myself very happy if I write 2 or 3 pages a day. But when I'm in the flow of it, half a dozen or more, maybe.
Huh. You write both westerns and historical mysteries. How
Mhm.
do the two genres influence each other in your work?
Well, all the mysteries that I've published so far actually have a Western setting, even if they're not specifically marketed as Westerns. The Mrs. Bede mysteries are set in Colorado about the year 1900. So I don't exactly, like I said, I don't market them as Westerns, but they do have that Western setting. It's kind of like, it's fun crossing two genres, the little old lady detective like Miss Marple with the Western setting. And I don't know, I've sort of invented a niche there, but and then the other mysteries that I've written, Land of Hills and Valleys, is I guess what you would call a semi-contemporary Western set in 1930s Wyoming, and Bridge to Trouble is set in 1920 in Montana. So Yeah, it's fun trying to put a classic mystery in a Western setting because I read a lot of English mysteries. Those are my favorites, the classic English mysteries of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah,
And it's interesting. It's fun trying to put that sort of plot in a Western setting. But yeah, it's I don't know if I would say I have two different approaches because so far I've been combining the genres when I write mystery.
yeah. That's what I like about westerns is you can combine them with so many different other genres.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It's like The Mandalorian is basically a western set in space.
Yeah, I've heard that. I've also remember hearing someone say that the original concept of Star Trek was basically wagon train to the stars.
Yeah,
I forget who said that, but I've heard it.
got a few more questions from viewers. Let's see. What are some of the challenges of getting handwritten pages to digital and then book?
Well, when I write my first drafts by hand, and then I take that and type it, and that's basically my first round of edits. I actually really enjoy that part of the process, taking that messy handwritten page, typing it up, and editing and polishing it as I go. And then I go through several more rounds of edits with the typed document, and I do my own formatting. I use a process where I create an HTML document and then use a software called Calibre to convert that into an ebook. So yeah, after having done it so many times, that part of the process goes pretty smoothly for me nowadays. But yep, that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah. What draws you to writing short stories and novellas rather than like a full length novel?
Well, I when I first started being a writer, I all I thought about was writing a full-length novel. I still dream of writing more novels than I have so far. I think I started writing short stories because having read so much older fiction, I didn't realize that the publishing industry was not exactly the way it was in the early 1900s. I thought everybody started with short stories and worked their way up to novels. I didn't realize how different a landscape it was from the time when there were so many magazines that were entirely or partly fiction. So I started thinking I'd write short stories and get them published in magazines or webzines. And um, at the time I started, that was not so easy for the genre that I chose to write. There were not a lot of places to publish historical and Western short stories, but I found that I enjoyed writing them too, and I enjoy reading short stories too, especially Western short stories. So I've just kept on writing them and have did find places to publish a few, including at the Western Online years ago, and publish them as collections when I have enough. But I still do dream of writing more novels. I have several
Yeah,
unfinished manuscripts that I really want to finish. I I enjoy writing both in different ways.
yeah. Question from Mike about the Western Online. You published a couple of stories with us back then, and that's really the reason I started that website was because I was looking for places to publish my short stories, and there wasn't any.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So
I had two stories published there. I think the first one was in 2015 and the other one shortly afterwards. The first one was called Revolt, and it was a quite short story about a group of brothers who found themselves in a tight situation after making some bad decisions. And then the second one was called Rubicon, and it was about three men just on the verge of about to commit a crime and having some second thoughts and wondering if it's the right decision. And both of those stories are now in my collection called Outlaw Fever, along with a few more.
how many short story collections have you published?
Well, four altogether Western collections, if you count my first book, which is out of print now. The first one was called The Ranch Next Door and Other Stories, and a few years back, I made the decision to take it out of print just because I felt some of those early stories were a little bit raw. Maybe I was still learning when I wrote them, and I felt like they didn't quite match up to things I've been able to write since. And then after that, I have three other collections: Wanderlust Creek and Other Stories, Outlaw Fever, and then my most recent book, The Smoking Iron and Other Stories, was just published in 2024.
Well, of all the different settings you've written in, from the contemporary to the more historical, which one do you enjoy writing the most?
Mm, I don't know. Geographically, I tend to enjoy writing in the stories set in the Wyoming, Montana region the most. I've written westerns set in other places, but that's the area that um, attracts me the most. And I know the classic era of westerns is like the open range cattle boom era of the 1870s and 80s, but I find the turn of the century particularly interesting because it's an interesting period because you kind of have the old west and the modern era starting to blend a little bit with it's still there being very much of a frontier, but also blending in things like automobiles and telephones and the Gilded Age Edwardian era. People don't always tend to think of that in connection with the Western, but if you look at the East and the West Coast at the same period, it's interesting. And then you get kind of what I was going for with the Mrs. Meade mysteries, blending the the culture of the Edwardian era, which is one of my favorite periods, with the West. I'd read some memoirs from around that time period. I remember one in particular. It was actually a book called Nothing Daunted by Dorothy Wickenden, and it was about the author's grandmother who in the early 1900s went west from New York State to teach school in Colorado. And I remember just the some of the interesting contrast. Teaching in a two-room schoolhouse on a mountainside, watching cowboys drive cattle, but they had the first telephone in the region installed in the schoolhouse, and so the contrasts and the mixes of that era interest me. So yeah, and then I also enjoy the 1930s and 40s, the history and the popular culture of that time. And again, the same thing. It's interesting looking at what the West looked like in that period. So, I guess I'm always kind of combining interests in my Western stories.
Are there any time periods or locations you'd love to write about but haven't yet?
Well, I think I've dabbled a little bit in most of the periods I'm interested in. I haven't really written any I haven't really written anything too in depth set in Texas, and that seems kind of like something that most Western writers need to check off at some point. I actually drafted an early novel, which it was an early novel, and so it didn't get published, which was set in Texas, and um, sometimes thought of pulling it out and trying to rehabilitate it, but yeah. So I suppose, yeah, I suppose I've probably written less set in the classic Western period than any other, actually.
Well, looking back at your earliest works, what's the biggest difference compared to your writing today?
Mm, in a technical sense, I suppose I've just, continued to learn to polish my skills a little bit. I think speaking of Westerns in particular, I think I've moved a little away from some of the I don't know if I'd say the tropes or the cliches of the genre. Like I I feel like the gunfighter plot has been overused somewhat in the Western genre, and also the loner protagonist. And I'm interested in writing stories about families and relationships in a Western setting, kind of focusing on some of those overlooked figures on the frontier, not just the wanderers and loners, but the families and neighbors and communities who helped settle the frontier. So, um, yeah, I mean, I do write stories that have some of the very classic Western elements in them, but I kind of like experimenting a little bit in that sense with things that haven't been done as much.
Yeah. A lot of your stories are from a different perspective. They're not always like the gunfighters. Like the recent story from you I just read was called "The Lark's Egg,"
Lark's
and when
Nest, yes.
the Lark's Nest, yeah. And when I was reading it, I was like, because the way I read, being a writer too, I try to like, how is this going, or where is it going to go to, and it completely surprised me. I wouldn't expect it to end that way.
That one actually, that story featured characters from that unfinished novel that I just mentioned a few minutes ago. I wrote a early novel actually, set in Texas, and I just was so fond of the characters. I had to write something about them at some point, and so that short story, Lark's Nest, took place before the action of the novel. So it was neat finally getting that into print.
So, do a lot of your characters have continuity between their stories?
No, actually, I think the Mrs. Meade mysteries are the only thing I've written where it's the same characters in multiple stories. Everything else stands alone so far.
That's another question from Mike. Do you read more than you write, or do you write more than you read?
Well, I think I'd say I read more than I write. Yeah, I'm always been a voracious reader, and yeah, probably. I mean, I'm always working on something. I'm always writing, but I think I read more, put in more hours reading than writing.
Yeah. That's another question from a viewer. What about your literary voice? Does your narration suggest a woman's view, or just an omniscient viewpoint?
Well, I think I write. I suppose probably in my style. I wouldn't be surprised if readers would find that there was something about it that suggests a woman's voice or point of view, which I think is perfectly natural. But I don't really write to it. I don't write specifically for women or even specifically for men. I think both men or women would enjoy my stories. I see both men and women as my audience. And in specific stories, it's a mix. Sometimes the point of view character is male, and other times it's female, and it just kind of goes by mood and what's right for the story.
Do you have challenges writing from a male character's viewpoint?
Well, I've read a lot of fiction that is written by men and from a male perspective, and so I hope enough of that has rubbed off on me and given me enough of a sense of how a man thinks and acts. I mean, I always hope when I'm writing, I hope this sounds authentic to a male reader. I mean, I don't think I've ever consciously struggled with it, but of course, I always kind of wonder in the back of my head. I wonder, is this turning out right? I hope it sounds right to a male reader.
Well, I wanted to show a few of your book covers on the screen here. Lands of Hills and Valleys. Can you tell us a little bit about this one in particular? I think you said it was your most significant publication to date.
Yes, Land of Hills and Valleys. It was published in 2020, but I actually started writing it 11 years earlier. I didn't
Wow.
it didn't it didn't really take me 11 straight years to write because I worked on it off and on. There were times when I put it aside for a while, for months or years to work on something else and then picked it back up again. And because I started it when I was pretty young, still in my teens, the early drafts were pretty well, let's just say nobody's going to see those. But I re outlined it a couple times because it is a mystery. the early drafts, I didn't think the mystery was complicated enough, and I completely reworked and re-outlined it a couple times, and gradually got it to the point where I was satisfied with it enough to publish it. It's as a matter of fact, it was while working on this book I came up with my unofficial motto for writing westerns: if you get stuck in the plot, add rustlers. It works.
Sounds like a pretty good idea.
Yes. Yep. This again. This is a kind of your. It's more less a formal whodunit murder mystery, as it's kind of more similar to the what they call a romantic suspense novel. I am a big fan of the English author Mary Stuart, who wrote romantic suspense in the 1950s and 60s, and her books usually featured a first person female narrator who wound up usually in a like foreign exotic setting somewhere, traveling somewhere and stumbling into a mystery or crime of some sort. And so I enjoyed that type of book, and I thought it would be fun. Actually, Land of Hills and Valleys, it was not originally written in the first person, and when I was really struggling with it some years back, one day I just suddenly had the idea, what if I tried this in a first person narration, kind of like a Mary Stuart style? And that was kind of the turning point. That was when it clicked and started to work. So again, that was kind of a, like I was saying earlier, taking the style and elements of a different genre and moving them into the West.
Let's see. Mike says he likes your titles. How do you come up with them?
The most instinctive parts of the whole process. I usually come up with titles pretty early, sometimes in the very earliest stages of writing a book or a story. Um, Land of Hills and Valleys was actually, it had a different working title when I first started writing it. And then I can't remember exactly at what point in the process, but it was changed. It's actually a quotation from a Bible verse from the Book of Deuteronomy, which is inside the front cover. And it just seemed to fit the story. Um, with the others, titles are actually one of my favorite parts because they actually sort of come instinctively, and it's just one of those things that I find fun to do, especially with short stories, because um, have written more short stories than novels, and it gives me more opportunities to come up with fun titles.
Yeah. And this your newest is the smoking iron. You said you designed this cover yourself?
I did.
That's very well done. I
Thank
like
you.
it. Tell us a little bit about the stories in this book.
Um, well, the the first two stories in the collection, Dakota Clothesline and The Heiress and the Horse Trade, they were published several years ago at a website that unfortunately isn't online anymore, Rope and Wire. And the others were all written over the last couple of years. Um, Several of them, as I said, the one thing that some of them have in common was that the ideas I'd been kicking around in my head for years before I actually wrote them down. The one story titled "Sheep Need a Shepherd" was one that I think I may have had the concept for in my head almost since before I published my first book. I had just had this idea for a Western story that was about uh, a minister who decided to raise sheep in cattle country. And I just thought that was a great starting concept, but I didn't write it for years because I just couldn't figure out how the rest of the story was, what was the point of the story, how it was going to go. And then about 3 years ago, I finally had that moment where something clicked about the plot and I was able to finish it. And as I said, Lark's Nest also went back a long way because it featured characters from an early unpublished novel. And the one straight up comic story in the collection, Professor Pruitt's Circulating Concert Company. That was also an old idea that I had partly written for a long time and finally finished for this one.
Yeah.
And the there's a bit of variety in the time periods and settings. The dates range from the early 1870s to the 1940s. The 1940s story, Big Aspen, is actually probably my favorite, my personal favorite in the collection.
Okay. I got a few of your other covers here. It's one of my favorites of yours. Left Hand Kelly has been out for quite a while. Can you tell us a little bit about this one?
Mm-hmm. That was an early one. It's a, I don't know whether you call it a novella or a short novel. And this one, actually, I can remember part of the inspiration for writing it. I was reading a lot of Max Brand back then, and I enjoyed a device that he used in several of his stories where the story was actually narrated not by the central character, but by a side character who was kind of like an observer, a sidekick who just sort of was looking on and watching the story play out. And so that was what I did with this story. It's narrated by a character who's sort of not, it's not his story, but he happens to stumble into someone else's and tells it what he observes. And the story itself is about a teenage boy whose father was a famous gunfighter and who daydreams about following in his footsteps, even though the era of the gunfighter is over. Again, it takes place kind of around the turn of the century, about 1900. And then what results when he ends up with an injured gun hand and can't use it anymore. And it's more about the kind of the emotional clashes between the various characters, the relationships between father and sons and between brothers and friends. I guess, even back then when I was still writing stories where a gunfighter was at the center, I was always interested in character development and relationships between characters.
Yeah. And here's your first. Let's see, that's the Sidekicks too. Tell us a little bit about this one. It's more of a comedy, isn't it?
Yes, it's a straight up screwball slapstick comedy in a Western setting. This one, I still don't know how it happened. I just, one day I had this idea and sat down and started writing, and it was probably the most fun I ever had writing. And again, the most straight up comic thing that I've written. It's again, it's narrated by the sidekick, but in this sense, it's more like a tribute to the comic sidekick who's always there following the hero around, but it's from his point of view and his very comical commentary on what's going on. And the plot involves a marriage of convenience and a family feud, which get tangled up together. And I like to describe it as P.G. Woodhouse meets the Hatfields and McCoys,
Uh,
is how I would describe the style.
do you think Western comedies are what made you decide to write one? You think they're like underrated?
I can't remember what made me start writing it, but yes, I do think they're underrated. Because if you go back to the earliest Western fiction, there was a lot of humor in the earliest Westerns, especially short stories. Not everybody realizes, oh, Henry wrote 40 Western stories, and he's probably one of the best known American humorists. And um, you do find quite a broad streak of humor, even in a lot of the early Western writers who weren't known particularly as humor writers. But I think you see that much more strongly in early fiction than you do mid 20th century and further on. And yeah, I think, like you said, you can cross almost any genre with a Western, and I think there's a lot of quite a lot of potential for writing straight out comedy Western stories. Usually, in my short story collections, there's at least one story in the book that's either straight out comedy or strongly humorous. I think
Yeah.
it's nice to have a bit of that in there.
Do you have a personal favorite story from all of your stories together? Like, which one's your very favorite?
Short stories or novels or both?
Both.
um, Land of Hills and Valleys, it is a favorite. And A Sidekick's Tale, like I said, is just the most pure fun of anything I've ever written. Um, One other thing that is a particular favorite of mine is Bridge to Trouble, which is a novella, and it's very much in the style, a similar style of Land of Hills and Valleys, um, with a young female narrator in Western setting stumbling into a mystery crime situation. And that one too, it's mystery suspense, but it also has quite a strong streak of humor throughout it. And that was one that I really enjoyed writing and was pleased with the way it came out. Among my short stories, again, I think a couple of the ones in my most recent book, The Smoking Iron, are probably my favorites. Um, the one that's set in the 1940s called Big Aspen, and yeah, the Heiress and the Horse Trade is also a favorite. That's another one that has a dash of humor in it. In my earlier collections, there's a story in Outlaw Fever called The Bird of Dawning, which is a Western Christmas story. And that's something I also I don't think you see quite as much of. And that one has always been a favorite.
Let's see. This is your first Mrs. Meade story. How long are these stories generally?
The shortest one is about 12,000 words, and the longest one is a little under 30, I believe, or around 30. So they're what I'd call novelette to novella length. Um, and I think again, they're very much inspired by traditional classic mysteries, but I play around with the conventions of that a little bit because um, they're not all murder mysteries. Mrs. Meade solves a variety of different crimes, from kidnapping to theft to mysterious disappearance, things like that. They're set in a small town in Colorado, about the year 1900. And the central character, Mrs. Meade, is a middle aged widow who lives in a boarding house. And her, not exactly sidekick, but the recurring character that she usually discusses ideas with and wrangles with a little bit, is the sheriff of the town, Sheriff Royal. And he was a really fun character to write. He's kind of a very gruff, brusque older man who gradually over the course of the series comes to respect Mrs. Meade's detective abilities quite a bit. So it's kind of like a unlikely friendship. And the Colorado setting is fun because it allows you to in each story to pull in a little something different, because you had the mining industry, you had cattle ranches, livestock ranches, plus Colorado was also a big health resort at that time period, and also there was tourism in the area. So it's an ideal place to kind of bring in any type of character that you kind of want to have on the scene. There's legitimate historical reasons for having all professions and classes of people in this little town. And yeah, the fifth one in the series even includes English characters, because that's another kind of niche topic that interests me, was the English in the Old West. I've read quite a bit about that and worked that into a few stories.
Yeah. So, are each of them standalone stories, or is it like one overarching
Yes,
story? Uh,
each one is a standalone story. They're a series in the sense that there's a handful of recurring characters. Some of the characters from the early books do reappear, so um, none of them directly spoils the ending of the last one, but well, you kind of know who survives and who's innocent if you start with the later ones. But yes, and there's five short novellas, and then I've also written a couple of individual short stories, which can be read in any order with the rest of the series.
Which of your stories were the Peacemaker Award finalists?
Left Hand Kelly was one, and the other was my short story Dakota Clothesline, which is the first story in the Smoking Iron and Other Stories.
What do you think made them stand out?
Well, I don't know. Left Hand Kelly was a finalist for Best Independently Published Novel. They still had a separate category. I'm not sure if they still do. It may just all be one category now. Back in the year it was published, 2015. It's published in 2014, and it was the 2015 awards. Um, and then Dakota Clothesline was a few years ago. Um, I really couldn't say. I Dakota Clothesline was one that I felt, again, it was a story which for me it centers very much around the relationships between the characters, but also the setting is very much a character in that one. The blizzard on the Dakota prairies, and that one, yeah, that was fun to write. It was fun to really be able to dig into the weather and the setting as a strong presence in the story. I enjoy writing about snow. I enjoy writing snowy settings. I don't know why I haven't done a little more of it, but
Did being a finalist for those awards change how you approached your future writing projects?
I don't think so. I hope not. um, yeah, I mean, if you if you think too much about what might possibly win an award, I think it could be more a distraction than anything else. I think you just kind of have to focus on writing the best stories you know how without trying to tailor it for possible awards. But
Mm.
it was definitely, it was a thrill being a finalist, very, very much a thrill and an honor. And keep trying, and maybe one of these days.
Yeah. Well, since you self-publish, what's been your experience with marketing your books? What's the most difficult part of that?
Just letting the readers who are out there somewhere know that the books exist, basically, which is kind of it in a nutshell. I've actually, over the last year or two, I've had more success doing live events, vendor events, and selling copies of my books in person. Um, I think selling books online has changed since I first published a book back in 2011. There are just so many more. There's such a huge volume of titles published nowadays, both traditional and independent. So there's just more books to compete with. And in one sense, the internet is wonderful because millions of people have access to your books if they come across them. But on the other hand, doing live events, it's like the people who are there, it's not millions of people, but every one of them actually sees your book and knows it exists. Whereas on the internet, it's a little bit harder to get the word out there.
Do you have any platforms that work best for promoting Western fiction? Like what?
Mm, Western in particular, I think I'm still feeling around trying to figure that out. There's quite a community of book lovers and readers on Instagram. Um, not perhaps not as many devoted Western readers. So sometimes I think some of my books have a bit of a cross genre appeal. People who just like historical fiction in general will like them. There seem to be more Western readers and writers on Facebook, but I'm not a big Facebook user, so I'm still feeling that out a little bit. And in the last year or so, there's been, I think, a little more activity among Western enthusiasts on Twitter.
Yeah, I've noticed that picked up a little bit here lately as well. What are some of your favorite Western movies, and have they influenced your writing in any way?
Mm. My my favorite, my longtime favorite is Rio Grande with John Wayne and Maureen O'Hara, the third in the Ford Cavalry trilogy. Um, I I've seen most of John Ford's westerns, the earlier ones in particular. They're all classics. One that I didn't discover until just a couple of years ago is actually the Australian Western, The Man from Snowy River. That one just really took me by surprise, blew me away. And even although it's an Australian Western, it has just so many of the classic elements of the American Western, and it's just a really incredibly visually gorgeous film and a really simple, compelling story. Among the classics, Shane is a favorite. Red River, I think, is the classic cattle drive movie, even though I think it fizzles a little at the end, but it's still a classic. Um, you mentioned we were talking about comedy westerns a while ago, and when I was a kid, my family always enjoyed Disney's The Apple Dumpling Yang and its sequel,
Uh,
and I think that's probably influenced me more than I realized at first. Um, and then also, when I was a kid, I saw a lot of the older TV westerns like Bonanza, and then later on, I think in more recent years, I'm more partial to the Virginian and Wagon Train as TV westerns. But yeah, I think Rio Grande and The Man from Snowy River would be my top favorites, and yeah, those are my top two.
okay. Are there any specific elements from those films that you find yourself drawn to when crafting your own stories?
Hmm. Well, I think Rio Grande shows. Like I said, I always kind of there's always a focus on the character development and the relationships between characters, and I think Rio Grande more so than the other two cavalry movies and some westerns in general. It's again the central conflict of the story is about family relationships between parents and child, and between a husband and wife. And I suppose that probably now, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you should ask because I had never really thought of it that way, but I suppose that's one of the reasons it appeals to me the most.
Let's see, question from Mike again. What do you think about The Shootist?
I have not seen that one actually.
Really? It's
No.
one of John Wayne's classics. You mentioned tropes earlier. What classic Western tropes? How do you balance those with fresh storytelling?
Hmm. Well, I think there are some things that are the classic elements of the Western that are the same no matter what type of character you're writing about. I mean, the element of conflict with the frontier, with the forces of nature, the weather, the land, and both both a sense of conflict with the elements of the land, but also love for them. I think that that's consistent across pretty much all westerns, no matter what type of character you're writing about. The West itself is always a character in the story, I think,
Yeah.
and yeah, I think that's probably something that is most universal. And th- there is, I mean, I think that I'm always interested in westerns that incorporate Westerners' actual work into the story. I mean, it's some cowboy movies and shows, cowboys seem to spend, all their time in town in the saloon, but actually in real life they would have been spending so much of their time actually in the saddle working cattle. And I think stories that incorporate uh, Westerners' actual work into the plot are effective, whether it's cowboys or homesteaders or railroad workers or miners. And I think that's a way, again, I think it's a way to add interest to the story, but still not wander too far from those familiar elements that Western enthusiasts like.
Yeah. Well, Mike says you need to watch The Shootist. It's a classic tribute to the character and to the Western genre.
I'll bear that in mind.
I think you'd like it if you other movies you've mentioned you like. You would like that one. How do you see the Western genre evolving in modern times? Like, how has it changed from this classic heyday of the Western to today's?
Um, well, that's a good question. I kind of think there's different strains in the genre. There are some writers who see themselves as still writing the same type of classic stories, and then there's others who are more of a revisionist tendency. And I think nowadays there's probably more of that cross genre work, incorporating mystery or comedy, or some people science fiction, fantasy even, into the Western. And I think, I don't know, I no profit here as far as what the future of the genre is like, but I think those different strains all exist. And myself, I kind of think I fall a little bit in between them. I Historical accuracy is important to me, but in a sense, I think it's fun writing stories that emphasize to some people, these classic elements of a Western story that everybody loves. They're not all entirely mythical. A lot of them are really based in historical fact, and it might surprise you sometimes on how some of the things you see in the movies actually do have a historical root in fact, even though in other respects the movies were not always accurate. And I
Yeah.
think that's what I'm interested in doing.
Do you think there's a resurgence in interest in the Western recent times, or does it still face challenges?
Well, I think in the last year or two, I don't know whether it's so much I'm seeing a resurgence or if I'm merely finding my way to other people out there who love the genre, but it does seem that there do seem to be more opportunities for Western writers in recent years. There's some new magazines and webzines and more anthologies coming out, and those didn't seem to be there as much back, about 13 years ago when I was first starting out. So I would say in the last year or two, it does seem like there is a little bit more of a resurgence of interest, and I've seen other people on social media commenting on that too, that they've noticed more people taking an interest in westerns, looking for westerns. So
Yeah, there are a lot more traditional publishers that are publishing westerns now. I've noticed since I've started this channel. There's, would you ever consider submitting to a traditional publisher?
I wouldn't rule it out if it was, if the right book or story and the right opportunity came along. Um, like I said, I enjoy the creative freedom of indie, but I would never 100% rule out going traditional or small press if the opportunity arose.
Yeah,
And I still through the years have occasionally submitted short stories to magazines, more mystery stories, but I actually am going to have a short story coming out in a Western magazine this spring, a new magazine, Go West.
Ah,
So
where can people find your books and stay up to date on all of your latest releases?
my books are available pretty much wherever books are sold: Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, etc. They're available in both paperback and ebook. Some of the individual short stories and Mrs. Meade mysteries are only available in ebook, but the rest are also in paperback. Um, I have been recently moved my blog to Substack, and so that's where I write. I publish some short fiction there and also blog about subjects that interest me and tie into my writing: history, books, the West, and that is at secondsentence.substack.com. And my author website is at elisabethgracefoley.com. I'm planning on revamping that soon, so it's may look a little bit under construction over the next half a year or so, but it's there and you can find information about all my books there.
Okay. Other than your upcoming release, are there any special promotions or events that you'd like to mention?
Um, Not at the moment. Hmm. Like I said, my most recent release was The Smoking Iron and Other Stories, and I have a short story coming out in a magazine soon, and then later in the year, a story in a multi author anthology, which hasn't been officially announced yet. Actually, also, I did have a story this past year in the multi author anthology Through Western Storms, edited by Richard Prosh. Um, that was a very exciting opportunity, so that is out there too.
I'm have to get a copy of that. I'm familiar with Richard Frost. We published some of his stories as well, the Western Online. Is there anything that you would like our viewers to know about you, like what they can expect when they find one of your books?
Um, well, like I said, um, I think that readers who enjoy just American historical fiction in general would enjoy my books, even if they haven't read many Westerns before. But I also think that straight up Western enthusiasts will find them in the classic Western mold. And yeah, and mystery readers who are interested in reading books in slightly unusual settings, maybe something they haven't read before, might enjoy some of the mystery ones. Um, yeah, but yes, like I said, I think I see myself as crossing genre a little bit, but especially my short stories are very much in the classic Western tradition.
Elizabeth, it's been a fantastic conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to share your experiences in your writing process and thoughts on the Western genre. For those watching, be sure to check out Elizabeth's books, including The Smoking Iron and Other Stories. You can find all of her work at her website and the links she's mentioned. Is there anything you'd like to make the audience aware of before we leave?
I think we've covered pretty much everything.
Okay,
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation, like you said. I've really enjoyed
sure.
it.
Well, we'll see you next time. I appreciate you taking the time to do this, Elizabeth.
You're welcome, and thank you.
Alrighty.